Welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, U.S. presidential candidate Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump face off in their third and final debate. I will ask my panelists their take on this year's dramatic, to say the least, election. And battery problems in Samsung smartphones are causing the company to lose billions in profit. Can the South Korean tech giant make a comeback? Any chance? And we start today's program in the United States, where Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton presented widely different visions for the future of their country during the third and final presidential debate yesterday. Neither candidate is popular among voters, but opinion surveys show Clinton now, after the third debate, is winning in the polls. Is that really true? Our panelists will tell us their views on this year's election, but first, this background story.
No handshake, but for the first third of the debate, a mostly civil exchange on domestic issues like gun control, abortion rights, and immigration.
But we have some bad hombres here, and we're going to get them out.
But when it came to foreign policy, sharp exchanges with Clinton saying that if elected, Trump would be too sympathetic to Russia.
Well, that's because he'd rather have a puppet as president of the United States.
No puppet.
The two candidates sparred over the Middle East, particularly Iran, Iraq and Syria, Trump accusing Clinton of failure during her tenure as U.S. Secretary of State.
Because of bad decisions.
The insults flew. Trump called Clinton a, quote, nasty woman. Once again, Clinton raised Trump's treatment of women, minorities and the disabled. But the most unprecedented moment came when Trump said he may not accept the result of the election on November 8th, something unheard of in modern U.S. politics.
I will look at it at the time. I'm not looking at anything now. I'll look at it at the time.
So finally, a debate of substance that the American people and the world deserve, but there were still the personal attacks on both sides. Will it be enough for Donald Trump to close the widening gap against Hillary Clinton? He only has a couple of weeks to do it. Nathan King, CCTV, Las Vegas, Nevada.
And here to discuss the U.S. presidential election, we have in our Beijing studio Professor Xie Tao. Long time no see, Professor.
Yes.
Of political science at Beijing Foreign Studies University. He's also writing a book recently called Crisis of American National Identity. You're going to explain about that a bit later. In Washington, D.C., we have Mr. Robert Moran, a partner at the Brunswick Group. That's a U.S. advisory firm. Welcome, sir. And from Iowa, also in the United States, Timothy Hagel, professor of political science from the University of Iowa. Welcome as well, Professor. So, to the two American panelists, let's begin with, what about the polls suggesting Hillary Clinton leading with big number? Do you think that's likely to project the real result of the coming election? Let's go to Mr. Moran first.
Sure. The U.S. election polling to date currently shows Hillary Clinton leading nationally by about 6 to 7%. And she's also leading in all the key states that a Republican would need to win the election. So she's ahead in Florida by 4 points. She's ahead in Ohio by 2, ahead in Virginia by, I think, 9. She's also leading in Colorado and Nevada, both Republican states that a Republican needs. She's ahead in North Carolina by just a few points. And she's trying to make a play for Arizona as well. I mean, our elections are run at the state level, and the state polling looks very good for her.
Wow.
Mathematically, Donald Trump's problem is that he's doing poorly with women, especially working age women. He's doing very poorly with Latinos, and very poorly with African Americans. And if you combine that, mathematically, it's difficult for him then to win.
All right. Professor Hagel, I know you are not a mathematician, professor, but I'm sure you have your own political science perspective about the possible result. Likely to be resembling the polls?
Well, actually, I did get an undergraduate degree in mathematics.
Oh, there we go.
I would agree that as far as Donald Trump's chances are right now, they look pretty slim. As the other guest was indicating, that polls suggest that he's behind, although some of those polls are within the margin of error. Of course, one of the big questions that we have is what's the turnout going to be? This time, because both candidates are so disliked, that there's so many unfavorables for them, that the concern is that a number of people just won't turn out. So that's what we have to wait and see. But right now, it does look very good for Hillary Clinton.
Before we go to our Chinese panelists, I still want to ask the two of you, American guests, to briefly comment about that. There has been suspicions about the accuracy of those polls before election, even 1 month before the election. Do the polls could really tell us about the direction of the wind? Mr. Moran first.
I think the polling's good. I mean, I started my career in political polling. We have so many political polls right now that if you look at the average of them, they give you a very strong indicator of where the vote is going. The challenge, I think, as our other guest has noted, is that both candidates have very negative perceptions. 62% of Americans have a negative view of Donald Trump as of this morning. 53% of Americans have a negative view of Hillary Clinton as of this morning. And that is causing some gyration in the polls. But if you look over a series of time and you average the polling results, you see a very clear path for Hillary Clinton for the presidency.
Professor Hagel?
I tend to be very skeptical of polls, just in general. I think that we have to be very careful when we're comparing one poll versus another poll. That I know that a lot of people, and this does make sense, to average them because any particular individual poll can have its problems, but hopefully if you average them together that those problems wash out. But we don't know for sure if that's the case. But again, over time that we get at least a sense of what's going on, and a good way to do this is to compare the same poll using the same methodology over time and see in that sense if the numbers are moving for one candidate or the other.
Professor Xie Tao here in Beijing, you're also, of course, one of those very well-known scholars from China about American studies. When you reflect back your studies about American elections this year compared to the previous ones, what will be the things, keywords jump into your mind?
First, I have to say the phenomenon of Donald Trump. Donald Trump will be remembered even after the election, even he loses the election.
Well, probably he's going to restart a reality show, so you never know.
Yes, that's first. Second is, like you mentioned, I think the other guests also mentioned, that both candidates are the least liked candidates in American presidential election, as far as there is polling. So that speaks a lot about the degree and the state of American democracy. Why the two candidates representing the two major political parties have candidates that are so disliked.
You have your answers?
I don't have an answer, but I think, maybe they're running out of better candidates. Maybe, even though they are very disliked, but they get nominated. And that speaks a lot about how much frustration and anger there is within some small but very active segments of the two parties' bases.
Let's go to the mathematics major in undergrad and certainly political science in graduate school. Professor Hagel, you got your answers for the question coming from Professor Xie in Beijing?
I think that there is a frustration here in the United States among the voters with the way government works. I think that we certainly do have better candidates, but an unlikely set of circumstances were in place this time to allow both Hillary Clinton for the Democrats and Donald Trump for the Republicans to end up being as unliked as they are and yet still become the nominee. I doubt we'll have that same set of factors replicated in the future, but you never know, and unfortunately we have to deal with it this election.
Mr. Moran, is it a systematic problem that we're talking about, or is it a random phenomenon that we're talking about here?
I think this is more an exception to the case. If you look, if you go back and you think about it, if Marco Rubio, for example, or John Kasich had won the nomination, they would likely be ahead in this election and would have much more positive views of them among the middle of the electorate. What has happened, and I think what some of your hosts have alluded to, is that the two political parties have become more polarized over time. And they've selected nominees that are more to the edges of their political spectrum and not towards the center. And that has happened over the years in U.S. politics, and this is an extreme case, I think, of that. but it's an extreme case also in terms of the people selected. And keep in mind that, you know, on the Republican side, Donald Trump never received a majority of the vote from Republican primary voters. He didn't need to. The vote was split 16 different ways with all sorts of different candidates, and he was able to marshal enough of a high-intensity base of support in those primary states. So in some ways, a little bit of this is an exception to the rule, but it's very much worth studying.
All right. Well, the primary might be one of those things that really worth studying, particularly when you have a whole long line of candidates over there. But Professor Xie, you and I have been observing it here in China and also there in the United States. For example, George W. Bush, the Republican president, before he was elected, there was the Florida vote counting. That was quite a dramatic moment. Barack Obama, when he was elected into the office, many people were very excited around the world. People got tears in their eyes because of the racial equity and many other issues. But we found him become a lame duck in the White House for 8 years almost. And now we come another election, and certainly there are some very dramatic figures, to say the least. What do you make of these different kinds of natures of drama that's going on with the American election? And by the way, there are dramas going on with other elections around the world, but this specific case study, what do you make of it?
Well, let me say this, even today, a large number of Americans still believe that Barack Obama was not born in the United States, and therefore he's disqualified to be the
You're not
president.
talking about Donald Trump's
I'm not saying, but this is so-called the birther conspiracy. Donald Trump, in my view, is a voice of this kind of people. And he's representing what I would call this a paranoid style in American politics, going back to this very famous American historian, Richard Hofstadter, that, sometimes in American politics, when you have crises, people feel so uncertain, insecure, and they would think there's a big conspiracy working against them. So look at Donald Trump. He's saying the election is rigged, and so everybody's ganging on him, and so this is unfair. And he even said that I'm not gonna concede the election if I lose the election. So this whole thing, that you put all these pieces together, Donald Trump is representing a large number of Americans who believe that America is now being, conspiracy. And Donald Trump is their spokesperson, is their savior, and he's the person to get them out of that conspiracy. Yeah.
So the question is, Professor Hagel, of course, we're still days before the election. We cannot know who exactly in the White House, but are the candidates really representing the views of the majority of the Americans? And also, there has been debates about the establishment vis-a-vis the other way around. Will the result of this election be encouraging about those debates or the other way around? Those are very crucial questions because they fundamentally influence the credibility of your own political system. Professor Hagel.
Yes, I'm not sure that the results of the election are going to answer that many questions. That whoever becomes the next president of the United States is going to have a difficult time because, as was indicated, the United States is very polarized politically. And it's an odd thing because, to a certain extent, both of these candidates are really not that extreme. That many conservatives are very unhappy with Donald Trump. They don't think he really is a conservative, that he's basically a liberal in disguise. Many progressives on the political left here in the United States are not sure that Hillary Clinton is really a progressive, that they fear that maybe she is too favorable to big business and so forth. And so there's a public persona and a private persona to a certain extent, and this is something that Hillary Clinton was found to have indicated in one of those leaked emails. And so whether it's Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton that's the president, either one of those folks is going to have a difficult time reaching out to the American people. So there's some healing, if you want to use that word, that has to be done after the election. And I think it's going to be difficult for either one of those two to be able to do it.
But on the other hand, Mr. Moran, as we know, the conservative or the progressive, they do not represent a majority of the Americans either. So about the nature of these two candidates, what do you make of them? Will they, whoever in the White House, be able to answer to the call of the American people, as you say, in America?
Well, I think we have several things that are going on in the United States at the same time. The U.S. is going through an economic transition to a post-industrial information economy, and that's putting stress on the middle class and on the electorate generally, and you're seeing some of those concerns with support for Sanders, support for Trump, and others. That's one thing. The second thing is broadcasting generally in the United States is declining with the rise of social media, and we have more voices than ever before, more fracturing with cable news and things like this. And so there's less of one perspective and less common ground than we had maybe in the 1950s and the 1960s when we had a mass society. We have now an even more diverse society in terms of where we get our information. And then you have the merger of politics and reality television, and the merger of politics and entertainment. And you see that with Donald Trump, and I think that's especially toxic within the U.S. context. The U.S. is just going through a number of changes all at once. Those stresses are being seen in our political system, and I think in time we'll work through those stresses and manage that. But it means that if Hillary Clinton is elected, she'll need to find some way to work with Republicans in the Senate and the House. And I think she's likely to do that because I think it would be in the best interests of the nation to do so. You can already see, by the way, Republicans, especially in the Senate, running in their campaigns saying, vote for me, I'll be a check on a President Clinton presidency. So many Senate Republicans are already cutting Trump loose, figuring that he'll lose, and are already appealing to voters, asking them to support them as a check on her power.
Right.
And that's how our system works. So I think once the election is resolved, you'll likely see some attempt by Hillary Clinton to move towards the center or cooperate with Republicans on some kind of a infrastructure or employment bill.
The only thing, the other thing that Professor Ji and many people talk about are the presidential debates. Of course, 3 of them, we watch all of them. As a journalist, I had to. And yet, you find it is more really about storylines, if there are any storylines, rather than cursing against one another, than real policy debate, because nobody, it seems, even among the journalists, are interested from the very beginning, as it was becoming ever more entertaining. The question is it a chicken and egg thing? Is the public that asking for more entertaining election, for better or for worse, or the election is becoming so irrelevant? The debates are becoming so irrelevant that it's becoming ever more entertaining, for better or for worse. Professor
Well,
Xie.
actually, I was giving a talk, before I came over here, and one of the questions from the audience is that, why, these 3 debates look like so mundane, so boring. And my tentative answer is that because both candidates, they really don't have substantive, innovative answers to the number of challenges that America is facing, unemployment, immigration reform, terrorism, and also like about Supreme Court justice appointment, and others. So neither candidate seem to, one, they don't really have nice ideas to put forward. Second, perhaps they don't want to now to unfold their new plans so that that may offend their potential voters, supporters. So they'd better hide their real intentions until after the election result is coming in.
It's ever more complicated, and certainly ever more what they call, with quote, entertaining. Having said that, though, one of the things Donald Trump mentioned in one of his debates is whether the election is rigged or not, whether the polls are correct or not. And we have some numbers to share with our viewers. September poll found the number there. 46% of registered voters in the United States believe that electoral fraud happens at least somewhat often. Well, 50% say it occurs occasionally or rarely. So that's a number back in September. Of course, after the statement being made by Donald Trump, the number has becoming ever more higher. Professor Hagel, I understand the city of Philadelphia, for example, working extremely hard in order to make sure fraud not happening, because Donald Trump was specifically talking about that city. But the question is, do we know the reality? How can we prevent that from happening? After all, your country is very proud of a peaceful presidential election and transition.
Yes, it was unfortunate that Donald Trump phrased that answer the way he did. I think that there's a general feeling, and both parties talk about this, and this goes back to what was being said before about the sort of the paranoia and the dealing in conspiracy theories, and both parties tend to do that, but Donald Trump seems to be emphasizing it this time, and people have caught on to that. But there is a concern, and we hear anecdotal evidence perhaps every election cycle of some voter fraud that occurs in one place or another. And Donald Trump has mentioned before that a couple of precincts in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia that no one voted for the Republican candidate, which would seem to be very, very unusual in a large precinct. Well, it could happen potentially depending on what the voter turnout was and so forth, but it does lead to that concern over voter fraud. And so Donald Trump, I think, is just trying to play into this idea that, again, we see often portrayed by both parties, that there's the system is rigged, that the voters don't have a say, vote for me, that I can fix that. And he's not really questioning, or I didn't get the feeling that he's questioning, despite other people thinking otherwise, that he's really questioning the system as a whole, but more a matter of that you need to vote for me, and we need to make sure that the elections are run in a fair and equitable way, and certainly that would be the case if he says he wins,
right.
But it would be the case even if he loses, unless it's so close that maybe there is some problem in a particular area, state, precinct, or whatever it happens to be.
That, of course, is one issue. The other issue is, Mr. Moran, what if when the election result comes out and one of the presidential candidates do not accept it, and that will be a big thing because we all remember Al Gore eventually accepted and talked to his voters that we should go ahead, let the president be in the White House. But this one possibly could be a little bit different.
Yes, America has a history of running elections spanning 4 centuries, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, and 2000s. And we have a history of the loser in a presidential election accepting the result and trying to help the country come back together. You have 2 instances of this in the modern era. In 1960, the Nixon team felt that they might have been robbed by the Kennedy team in Illinois and lost the election. But they did not question the election outcome. Nixon supported the election outcome. And the same is true even in the 2000 Gore-Bush race. Gore accepted the outcome. So what Donald Trump is claiming here and talking about here is actually unprecedented, at least in the modern era of American politics, and is problematic at several levels. Now, talking about this as he has, we have polling that shows that 41% of Americans now think that there could be, that an election could be stolen, and 73% of Republicans think that that could happen. And so by talking about this, Donald Trump is driving up the number of Americans that believe the election could be, quote unquote, rigged. Yeah. The problem with this is a U.S. election happens in something like 3,000 counties across 50 states, and is not something that you could easily rig.
All right, we'll see. Professor Xie, fair or not, an election has always been the most important issue. What do you make of it as an observer, very briefly?
Well, yeah, just going back to the 2 incidents that the other commentator mentioned.
1960 and, of course, Al Gore as well.
Speaking of rigged election, I think there's no other person who feels so much wronged and robbed than Andrew Jackson in 1824. He had the largest number of popular votes and the electoral college votes, but he didn't get the presidency. So I think what really the problem with Donald Trump is that he's whipping up this suspicion, conspiracy, and he's doing profound damage to the American democracy. He's basically challenging the bottom line of American democracy: free, competitive election, but you also have to concede when you lose.
I can tell, Professor Xie, you have done really quite some research about the American political system. Before we go, very briefly from the other 2 American guests, 5 seconds for each of you, gentlemen. Likely to be big turnout this time, or people are going to lose face in the election, therefore turnout could be very small. Mr. Moran, 5 seconds for you.
I think average turnout with Hillary Clinton winning the Electoral College.
All right, Professor Hagel.
I think that at this point Hillary Clinton probably will win the Electoral College too, but I think turnout will be a little below average.
We'll see what's going to happen not long from now. Timothy Hagel, Robert Moran, Xie Tao, thank you so much, gentlemen, the 3 of you, for shedding some insight on the election. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Still to come. battery problems in Galaxy Note 7 phones are causing Samsung to lose billions in profit. Will customers go back to the company after being burned? You're watching World Insight coming to you live from Beijing from Monday to Friday every day. South Korean tech giant Samsung has announced a dramatic drop in profits after battery problems forced the company to recall millions of its smartphones. I will ask my panelists how the debacle will affect the world's smartphone market. But first, this background story.
Flagship destroyed. Samsung says smartphone battery problems will result in a $3 billion profit loss over the next 6 months alone. The company permanently halted the sale and production of its Galaxy Note 7 smartphones on October 11th. In early September, it recalled 2.5 million Note 7 phones. Consumers say the devices easily overheat and catch fire. Batteries and replacement handsets may also be catching fire. A number of countries like the US and Japan have banned people from taking the Note 7 phones onto planes, citing safety concerns.
If there's enough evidence, hard data, that it could actually cause a fire on a plane, then it's probably a good idea.
I think it makes sense. I don't think airlines can take the risk of having dangerous electronics on board.
Samsung is desperately trying to keep the loyalty of its customer base. The company recently offered Note 7 users $60 worth of credit if they buy a different Samsung phone. Special booths have been set up at South Korean airports to let travelers swap their Galaxy Note 7 smartphones before getting onto flights. The company is also offering customers a phone to use for free during their trip if they don't want to swap.
That's a very good decision because this device has caused too much damage and it's too risky. And I don't think it's just the battery problem. It's more of a design problem.
Samsung's rival Apple has pushed aggressively into the South Korean market in a bid to supply growing demand. According to mobile carrier Korea Telecom, 50,000 iPhone 7s sold out in 15 minutes. Experts say Samsung has a tough fight ahead.
There was a huge race, and clearly some corners that were dangerous were cut. And then I think the sort of part two failure, which was maybe even worse, was they had to get this back on the market because otherwise they were hemorrhaging, right? And their ultimate fear came to pass.
Samsung used to be the largest smartphone company in the world. The battery crisis threatens to force the Korean tech giant off of its throne. Loss of consumer confidence could hurt Samsung for years. But many consumers have short memories and care more about who has the next best product instead of mistakes that were made in the past.
For more discussion on the topic, we are joined here in our Beijing studio, Jay Huang, who's the founding partner of Jaystone Venture and also former managing director of Intel China. Welcome, sir. Joining us from Washington, D.C. in the U.S., we have Mr. Choi Staggerone, who's a senior director at the Korea Economic Institute. Welcome as well, sir. May I start by asking you, Mr. Staggerone, what do you think the impact of this specific incident regarding Samsung mean for the overall brand of a smartphone and possibly the credibility of this huge conglomerate?
Well, this is the key question for Samsung going forward. What does this do to the reputation? The Note 7 had been reviewed as basically the best phone of 2016. It was seen as being a significant step forward for Samsung. And now to have this problem, specifically one that's not a software glitch potentially that impacted a program, but that made the phone itself unsafe. So moving forward, Samsung has a series of questions to answer. One, are they going to be able to take and identify what the actual cause of the flaw was with the battery? Two, will they be able to take and convince consumers that this is a problem that does not extend to other Samsung models? And three, will they be able to convince consumers going forward that they've resolved the issue and therefore all Samsung products going forward are safe? If they're unable to do that, they run the risk of consumers turning to other products, be they Apple, Chinese, or other low market designs from India as well.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Huang. You see a lot of competitors, of course, vis-a-vis the Samsung Note, the Apple, and even Chinese Xiaomi, and some of the others. The question is, how long can they recover And how long can they be able to, Samsung, answer the three questions just asked by Mr. Stangeron?
It's very hard to say how long they can come back. We have good news and also bad news. And the good news is, the smartphone usually, and the cycle for smartphone is relatively short. People tend to change their phones, and then every 2 years or maybe every 4 years. So people may easy to forget, and so the previous problem. On the other hand, that also says that people's loyalty to the brand is less than maybe compared to other products. So this is a double-edged sword for Samsung. And previously, we see some of the international and vendors in China, for example, the computer and notebook vendor, they had a similar problem in China, and then they lost their brand name has been damaged significantly. They never ever recovered their market leading position and after the crisis. So it's very hard to predict right now.
But you also have other example, for example, Toyota. Recall their products was quite something, and the stock market not doing very well at all for a long time, but eventually it did recover. Mr. Stangeron, what does it take to recover? Better products, certainly, and what else?
I think not only do they have to take and demonstrate that they've resolved the issues with the battery, but they have to develop innovative and superior products to their competitors. Right now they're in a situation to where people will be looking at other options. And to bring those consumers back, they're going to have to convince them not only is that product safe, but that it's a product that they desperately want to have. Phones tend to be almost cultural items. This is one of the reasons why the iPhone has been successful. And so to take and get that, as we would say in the United States, almost cachet back is going to be the real challenge for Samsung. And to do that, they're going to have to take and continue to innovate.
Samsung Note-7 had problems for quite some time. 2 weeks after the problem was being exposed to the media, they recalled the product. But only 5 weeks later, they stopped producing that specific Samsung Note-7. Some suggest that the efficiency of that decision has been relatively slow regarding the scale of explosion in a way in terms of the news about the Samsung Note-7. Mr. Huang, what would you say?
I think the way that Samsung handled this crisis, I don't think it's a very good one. And at least it shows they didn't know the root cause of the problem. Originally they thought it was a battery problem. After replacing the battery, and then they got the problem popping up again. So this is really, in terms of crisis management, I don't think they have done a very fantastic job. And so this is also hurt their brand name quite a bit.
But you've seen, Mr. Stangeron, that manufacturers or the designers of products that have problems tend to believe in the lesser version of the possible problem that the product could have. And only always after some twists and turns, they accept that the eventual reality. Is Samsung another demonstration, this time with Note-7, of that? And meanwhile, what does it say about Samsung, this specific company itself? After all, it's been one of those leading companies from South Korea about new technology and probably the future, some even consider some time ago. And is that contagious also in other South Korean companies? Many would wonder even.
Well, as you say, we do see this often. Companies take and they would like to take and draw out the time for a recall, review the product, perhaps even suggest that it's user error in some cases. Clearly in the case of the Samsung phones, that wasn't the case. But I think one of the challenges that Samsung faces here is that, when they entered into this recall, it wasn't done smoothly. They may have actually tried to go too quick, to where many companies actually maybe delay and try to put things off. We saw a situation to where they didn't coordinate with US regulatory authorities, they didn't coordinate with other regulatory authorities around the world. That led to confusion about how the recall was taking place. And so, in a sense, perhaps Samsung was too eager to take and try and fix the problem. And that may have led to further problems in terms of the recall phones. So I think in that sense, Samsung maybe should be faulted for going too quickly rather than too slowly. But in terms of the broader cultural issues we've seen, there are indications now that as part of its review process, Samsung is going to look into its procedures in both design and testing. We've seen indications that Samsung actually tested the battery internally rather than through external certification processes. I think we're likely to see these types of things change. But it does raise a question, broadly speaking, about the cable themselves. If, because you do have the situation where they buy products from different companies within the broader family, if you might see these similar type of problems pop up.
Of course, Apple operates in a very different way compared to Samsung and some of the other smartphone producers, including Chinese ones. For example, they usually come up with products of their own, almost for all components, except some very special ones. And yet all the others are operating differently. This also is a demonstration, Mr. Huang, of how much you should trust your partners, your business partners, and what kind of credibilities you together could provide to the overall consumers. I think that's a big question mark as we go along this road.
I don't think the number of the component you used from third parties is really an issue. If you compare to Apple with Samsung, for example, almost all the components Apple uses are from third party. And the chips and actually some of the Apple's CPU in the smartphones actually manufactured in Samsung factory. And then compared to other smartphone manufacturers, Samsung used a lot their own and components from Samsung families. So I don't think that the third party is an issue. In the smartphone industry, the competition is really, really intense. And this is perhaps not similar like an automobile industry, as you mentioned before. Even before this crisis, we see Samsung's leadership position already being eroded significantly by the Chinese vendors. And because the Android phone, for example, it's very difficult to make a differentiation among all the vendors. So all the vendors has to fight very hard and then try to make some features unique. Like, for example, like a dual camera. For example, you have to charge your battery very quickly. Some of the features, when they first come up with, and it looks like pretty unique, and the next year they become standard features. As we can see, and the competition is really intense. So all the vendors try to fight for like a time to market.
That's right.
You maybe ship your phone before Apple does, for example. That's added pressure, and also on the features and also on the price. So this is make them quite vulnerable and to ship out the product with a defect. However, and then the product defect is one thing, crisis is another one. I think the way they handled it and from product defect into a big crisis, there's a lot of things that they should learn.
Eventually, what would this mean? I mean, at this moment, Samsung, of course, has to scratch its head and trying to figure out what's going on and do enough to show to the outside world it pays attention and correct these mistakes and things like that. And that means time. During this period of time, what would that mean for the other smartphone producers? What kind of competition are we likely to see from now on?
I'm pretty sure the others, including Apple, and they're quite happy, and then they see this is the opportunity for them to gain the market share. Globally, Samsung's still the #1 market share and the leader, and then it's opportunity and for Apple and from the top end and also the Chinese vendor from the lower end and to erode the Samsung's market share.
Well, Mr. Staggeron, what do you make of it?
Well, I think this is correct. Samsung actually has been trying to fend off both Apple and vendors in China, India, and other countries for the last couple of years. So they've had this challenge to where they've had Apple on the high end eating into their margins and companies like Xiaomi eating in on the low end. And so this creates an opportunity for all of them to gain greater market share. And the real challenge here too, though, is that we look at this even beyond volume. You have a situation to where many of the smartphone manufacturers, Apple gets the vast majority, potentially up to 90% of the profits from all the smartphones. Samsung tends to get what's left. And so the real question, I think, for Samsung, and the reason the Galaxy Note is such a difficult challenge for them is that, this was a high-end phone. It was going to be a high-margin phone. It was the most expensive phone Samsung had out there up till now. And so they're going to really see it on that sort of profit side of their smartphones as well in terms of, overall globally and internally.
Okay, Mr. Stangarone, I understand you're an expert on Korean economy. Before we go, we have 30 seconds left only for you. What do you think this story about Samsung mean for the other big family conglomerates coming from South Korea?
Well, I think it demonstrates some of the challenges we're seeing right now. You have the Hanjin bankruptcy going on. You have a need for to have structural reform, both in the shipbuilding industry, the steel industry. So I think it's reflective of the broader challenges some of the South Korean conglomerates are facing right now.
Choi Stagaron and Jay Wang. Thank you so much, gentlemen, the two of you, for helping us understand the situation. All the best, and also have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you, really appreciate it.
You too.
That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of a program, visit our website. Just type in World Insights CCTV News into your search engine. You will be able to find us. Or you can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next week for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night and have a great weekend.